We're going to look at two different things that are found, one in low-lying wet areas, skunk cabbage. The other, sheep sorrel, is a common thing that is very common in gardens. I know that we have a lot of it, and it can be very pernicious as a weed, but it turns out that the weeds can be very beneficial for us too. So we're going to start off with with skunk cabbage. And skunk cabbage is known as Symplocarpus fetatus, which essentially is stinky. And the part that is typically used from a medicinal standpoint are the roots and the seeds. So we can see that in the early spring, this is how it comes up. They have giant leaves and have the flower. And there's actually a brown variety as well as the yellow variety. The roots are quite thin and quite tenacious in the kind of boggy areas where it grows. This is in the late summer after it's kind of broken down, and there's some seeds lying here beside it. But this is what the seeds look like of the of the skunk cabbage. It actually was known as a starvation food by the Native American tribes that were in the vicinity, because it's one of the first things that's green that pops up in the spring. So you can eat the leaves, but they need to be boiled because they have a presence of oxalic acid in them, which can be kind of burning to the mucous membranes. But for medicinal purposes, the roots and the seeds are the primary parts that are used. So this is what it looks like in a place where it grows. In swampy areas where there's plenty of moisture and water. So giant green leaves that are present. So some primary properties that skunk cabbage has that are medicinal in value. It induces sweating, so sudoriferous. It also functions as an expectorant, so basically it aids mucus removal from the lungs and trachea and the bronchi. Also a pectoral. So that's just another way of saying it's something that helps the chest area. So that would be like an expectorant would be helping the chest area. So decongesting essentially. It also functions as an antispasmodic. So it prevents muscles cramping, particularly the smooth muscles. Smooth muscles are the muscles that control all organs, and also organs that have substances flowing through them, like the digestive tract. So your small intestine, your large intestine, and so those are going to be where you find your smooth muscles functioning in that area. So if you have muscle cramps, then like intestinal cramps or stomach cramps, that can help with that. Also functions as a stimulant. So that basically they're herbs that increase the activity of an organ or a system, basically bringing it up to a higher level of function. A tonic will do the same thing, but over a longer period of time and at a slower rate. So a stimulant is more rapid, a tonic is more slow, and over time you would see an increase in function. Also a diaphoretic, which is another term for a perspiration promoter. So it aids in sweating. And there are times when you'd want to use something that would aid sweating. For example, if you're trying to cleanse your body, sweating is a cleansing mechanism that you can use. Sometimes we get that through a fever, but it can aid in that. So in a way, I'm not sure if it's actually a fever inducer so much as just aiding in perspiration formation. So in some circles, this was a very well-known remedy. It's a very old-fashioned remedy. We don't usually think of skunk cabbage as being beneficial in any way because it's rather stinky and reminds us of skunks. But it was actually used very reliably in tuberculosis situations and used in chronic catarrh. Basically, that's just excessive mucus drainage from the nose and throat. Catarrh, referring to mucus, just helps to bring that under control. So basically it helps all lung and bronchial infections. So one of those is pleurisy. Basically that's an inflammation of the linings around the outside of the lungs. So in the pleural cavity, you have a lining of tissue around your lungs, and then there's another lining on the cavity wall in which the lungs sit. And there is a fluid that is in between those two membranes that as you breathe, your lungs slide very easily inside that cavity. When that becomes inflamed, that's what pleurisy is, an inflammation of those membranes, that fluid breaks down or is not present, and those membranes stick in such a way that every breath you take is very painful. Deep breathing is very difficult. Someone who has long-term or pleurisy for an extended period of time could very easily develop pneumonia because they're not taking deep breaths. So it aids with that, that issue. Also helps with hay fever, whooping cough, and spasmodic asthma. So these are just some kind of good things. Hay fever affects a lot of people, basically as pollen, grass-based pollen in particular, but kind of a good thing to have in your back pocket and know where you have a skunk cabbage patch. Whenever I'm driving around, hiking or anything like that, I'm just looking around and noticing the plants that are around, and they are my friends. And you want to know where your friends live and be able to know how to work with them. So keep an eye out for the things that are around you. Some other areas where it has benefit is chronic rheumatism, dysentery, aids in calming nerve troubles. So there's kind of a list of things here that it's beneficial for. Various spasms, so those will be muscular spasms, convulsions, so that's a nervous tissue or nervous system overexcitation, along with epilepsy, and hysteria. So it can help calm the nerves. Also helpful in edema, or the old term is dropsy, and it's been noted as being beneficial in pregnancy, especially during labor and delivery. I would just always recommend checking that out for sure. Whenever you have something involved with pregnancy, you want to just make double sure that you're doing the right thing in that realm. So when you prepare it as an ointment, it can relieve pain from all external tumors, various sores, and fungal infections. So it has some antifungal effects. You can see the picture here. They have a poultice on a wound area. So basically it's just ground up leaves in this case. The fresh leaves are used as a poultice. So crush them and put them on swellings and cuts. Essentially, it aids in the granulation of tissue, basically new tissue formation, provides a medium, and accelerates the healing process. Also, I believe it functions to a degree as a astringent, which basically constricts the blood vessels, and if it was bleeding, would reduce the bleeding associated with a cut or a wound. The roots can be used as a tea, has a very peppery flavor associated with it. Great for winter colds and bronchial spasms, asthma. Functions as a blood purifier and cleanser. If you're doing a cleansing, a kidney cleanser, and then eases the root tea can ease labor pains. So you can harvest those roots and dry them, and then use them in a tea form when it's needed. So the fresh roots, poultice from the fresh roots can also be helpful in cuts. The crushed leaves are probably the easiest access, but if you had fresh roots available, that would work as well. So skunk cabbage root, very helpful for spasms and cramps. Again, that's the smooth muscle that it's aiding in functioning with in the antispasmodic role, especially when connected with stress or fear. So sometimes people have a lot of associated issues in direct association with various stress that they're undergoing or fear factors. The leaves, again, should not be eaten raw. They have oxalic acid crystals as a major constituent in the leaves, but they can be used when cooked. Oftentimes the natives would take them and rinse them several times before consuming them. The seeds keep well for very long periods of time. So they're a good kind of a long-term medicinal source. The roots have a 1-year harvest cycle. So use them in the first year that you have them, and then replace them. Collect them in the fall or in the early spring is the best time to pick those up. The leaves can actually also be used as a lining of can kind of be used like parchment. So the dead leaves or the fresh leaves in containers that you might put things to store other foodstuffs. So they can kind of, because they're so large and kind of waxy in a way, they can be helpful in food storage. So that's skunk cabbage. So next time you look at skunk cabbage, you'll probably see it in a different light, or the next time you smell it, you'll think about it in a different way. Interestingly enough, the ways that this is used, the skunk cabbage odor is pretty much taken care of and not an issue. It's usually only noticed when you're actually collecting it. So skunk cabbage. The next one that we'll look at is sheep sorrel. So it's another vinegary herb that is present. This is a very classic blade style of it. My kids like to eat it, just pick it right out of the ground, and it's got a nice tart vinegary taste to it. It's a great addition to salads, but it has some medicinal value as well. Here's a cluster of it in a garden setting. Here are the roots. The roots are very long and stringy. And in fact, I've read that where gardeners attempting to get rid of sheep sorrel, if they go and cut up the ground, cut those roots up, they just end up spreading it even worse because those roots will take root and they send them in long runners and pop up here and there and everywhere. This reddish haze here is all sheep sorrel in blossom. So those are the flowers and going to seed of the sheep sorrel. So down below here, where my cursor is where sheep sorrel, the basal rosette is. So again, the roots and the leaves are the primary components used, although sometimes the flowers are used in addition. So it functions as a diuretic. So a diuretic basically increases urine output. It can be as an anti-scorbulitic, essentially preventing or curing scurvy. And the only way it would do that is if it had a high vitamin C content. So it's a good source of vitamin C. It does tend to pop up fairly early in the spring. So sometimes in places where there are long winters, you get vitamin C from fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, fresh leaves. And if someone, in the old days when people were surviving on things that they had stored, dried things like dried grains and dried things with no fresh food over the winter, scurvy could become an issue. And so this is one of the things that could be used to bring that back around. Scurvy is a connective tissue disorder that is a manifestation of vitamin C deficiency. We can have subclinical deficiencies of various vitamin deficiencies, but the most obvious one for vitamin C of a clinical deficiency is scurvy. And we know about that, of course, from the people who spent many months on ships exploring. They would often come down with scurvy, a very debilitating disease. And that's why they would take on board things like potatoes and limes and lemons. In fact, the British sailors were called limeys because of their preference for limes in order to help keep the sailors well from scurvy. So interestingly enough, another medicinal property is as a refrigerant. So it can aid in cooling like a febrifuge, fever reducing. So keeping some of the leaves and the roots around for fever reduction could be a beneficial thing. It also is a vermifuge. It's nice to know what things are able to expel worms. So parasitic worms can be destroyed and expelled through taking in of the fresh or teas from the sheep sorrel. So using it, you can use it fresh like spinach or cooked. Again, actually spinach has oxalic acid in it too, but not to the same level that sheep sorrel has. You can actually taste it because it's kind of bitter and not as much oxalic acid as you would find in the skunk cabbage that we previously. So it's again a blood purifier and said to be warming to the heart. So if you take the root of sheep sorrel, this common weed from the garden, and you boil it and use it as a tea, it can be helpful for excessive menstruation. Also hemorrhaging, so two blood emitting issues. Can also aid in removing kidney stones. So jaundice is a liver condition, and so it can aid in that. So tea from the flowers, you can see the flowers over here on the right. So these are some of the flowers that are just coming out in this particular example here. A tea from the flowers is beneficial for internal ulcers. So that would be like stomach ulcers. Again, a good source of vitamin C for scurvy prevention and reduction. And then scrofula, which basically is glandular swellings from the pathogen that causes tuberculosis when that pathogen is in the body somewhere outside of the lungs. Typically, tuberculosis lodges in the lungs and creates fibroids and other issues in the lungs that create disease and death eventually, if not treated or removed or encapsulated. But if it gets outside of the lungs, it can also cause swellings as well. So the tea from the flowers can be beneficial for that. And basically beneficial for all types of skin conditions. You can use in irritations, you can use it as a wash. And the recipe for that is 1 ounce of sorrel flowers. So those could be dried or fresh in 1 cup of water, of hot water. So as a tea. Again, you can use the leaves as a poultice on cancer, boils, and tumors. So these are going to be typically external if you're using them in a poultice form. And then the cold drink can function as the cold tea can function as a refrigerant. So we talked about that earlier. So a fever reducer. So using it cold for that. So again, this is a very common thing that many people find in their gardens or in their yards and around. And it's just nice to be able to know what God's provided for us in nature that we can just go and grab and pick, because we may not always have a Tylenol or an aspirin that is readily available. So there was some research done, Bicker et al. In 2009 in Phytoterapia journal noticed that the tannins from sorrel have a astringent function and can aid in mitigating diarrhea, and also very beneficial in chronic upper respiratory infections by basically aiding fluid reduction in those situations. So that's good. It also has antiviral and anti-cancer properties from the phytochemicals that are present in it, and basically has anti-proliferative effects. Basically, it keeps it from expanding and growing. So cancer basically doesn't have the programmed death signals that most cells have. All our cells have a specific lifespan. Red blood cells are about 30 days, skin cells about 30 days, bones about 10 years. So your bone cells, if you go from you have a complete turnover of your bone cells in about 10 years. So every tissue has a specific lifespan associated with it, unless it's cancerous. And then that apoptosis or programmed cell death signal is turned off in those cells. So there's a genetic anomaly associated with cancer cells of all types. And so it can function as an anti-proliferative, and basically keeping it from dividing and growing and moving. So the dosage was a 75 to 100 microgram per milliliter of 90% aqueous methanol extraction. And that was studied by Tuzan and Nartia et al. In the Food Nutrition Science Journal in 2013. So in 2011, in Molecules magazine, Kokovo et al. Noticed the antiviral effects and anti-cancer effects of the sheep sorrel again. And it's been noted as one of the ingredients in Essiac tea. So Essiac tea is a type of tea that has some strong therapeutic effects, has multiple ingredients as a part of it. It was essentially derived by the Ojibwe Indians. So you can find various Essiac tea formulas, but it was originated by the Ojibwe, and the sheep sorrel is a primary, or at least a constituent of this Essiac tea. So there is a couple in vivo studies as well. So remember, in vitro is in the test tube. In vivo is actually in living systems. In this, like you and I, they found that sorrel extract reduced influenza A infection of the host's cells, and also reduced its growth even if once it was infected. So it reduces the infection, but then also reduces the growth. So it's an antiviral in that regard. Dirksen et al. In 2014 found on PLOS One. And then Olaf et al. In 2009 on the American Botanical Council found both antimicrobial and antiviral properties. And basically it helps reduce mucus viscosity, so it makes it more runny, and aids in an anti-inflammatory agent way. So actually cutting mucus is a good thing, because a thick, sticky mucus is very difficult to expectorate or cough up and move out of your lungs and out of your bronchial tubes, out of your nose, out of your sinuses, your paranasal sinuses. Just really clogs things up. So if you can cut the mucus and aid its passage, that's a good thing, which makes me just think about something that I hadn't thought of until just now. But one of the signature features of cystic fibrosis is very thick, sticky mucus that's very difficult for the individual to get rid of. Very rigorous mechanical removal processes and various drugs. Basically, they have a missing chloride channel that's present that would allow that mucus to be removed easily. And I wonder if perhaps using sheep sorrel teas might help cut that mucus from a mechanical perspective, as opposed to having your body do it in its own cellular processes. So just something I was thinking about as I was speaking here just now. So it could have a benefit for cystic fibrosis patients. So we looked at two different things tonight. We looked at sheep sorrel on the top. So this is a nice, yummy looking clump. We can use it in salads, but it has lots of different medicinal properties. Here it is again with in flower. And then our skunk cabbage in several different forms. Here with this nice yellow cap, hooded cap, and this will become the seed stalk eventually. It's interesting that in the spring when this first comes up, they can actually increase the temperature around the flower by several degrees, preventing it from freezing during the winter as it's first coming out. It's one of the first green things that starts poking up in the spring out of the snowpack. So that's looking at sheep sorrel and skunk cabbage, their various medicinal properties.